profession. Let's say it said that Adlai Stevens.
Hello everyone, Jared here with another video. The first video in a long series. It's going to be talking about movement training, how to begin a body weight training practice. This video is for anybody who is interested in getting into movement or body weight training. Kind of use those two words interchangeably. Anyone who's been doing standard gym workouts and wants something a little bit more. Maybe you're like me and you just want to be able to sit comfortably in positions like being cross-legged on the floor. Or maybe you're also like me in another sense where you're on the go a lot and you want something that's really accessible. You can do anywhere, anytime. You don't necessarily want to be in a gym. You want to be able to keep yourself in great shape wherever you go, wherever you are, whenever you want to do it. And we are going to start today with two essential mindset shifts and some of the fundamental movement patterns that are critical to understand and be practiced in order to maintain a healthy body, but also just to create solid foundations to build upon to get more complex, to get more advanced with your body weight training practice. The first mindset shift is one from quantity towards quality. In things like weightlifting, your more sort of standard gym workouts, we're very focused on quantities. How many reps can we do? How much weight can we lift? How much total volume do we have if you're a bit more knowledgeable about things like progressive overload? And while these things are important, we can't forget about these things entirely. What is much, much more important in movement training is the quality of our movements, of the exercises we perform, of each and every set, each and every repetition, flow, basically of our whole practice. How much quality can we get out of everything that we do? Of course, again, we do need to count how many reps we do. We do need to remember how much resistance we're using, and we'll talk about how you can manipulate resistance levels using nothing but your own body. But it is most important to understand that the quality of your movement patterns needs to increase over time in order to make progress. That is the main way in which we progressively overload in movement training. If you don't understand what progressive overloading is, it's definitely worth a quick Google search. It's basically just increasing total volume over time, reps times sets times resistance used over time, basically just making things harder as you continue with your practice, okay? We do need to progressively overload, but the manner in which we do that in movement training is primarily by increasing the quality of our movements. Now, what do I mean by increasing quality? There's a few things here. One of the big ones is alignment. So basically form. How is your form? Your form doesn't need to be perfect when you start an exercise, but you do need to set the intention that your form should get better and better and better over time. If you've been doing push-ups the same way you do push-ups now as you did 10 years ago, that's not gonna fly in movement training. That's not gonna make you any progress, that's not gonna make you any gains, and that's not going to help you grow in your practice. Now, you don't have to have a perfect push-up to start, but your intention should be to achieve a perfect push-up or near a perfect push-up later on in your practice. Every time you come back and do push-ups, they should be getting a little bit better. The second thing is control. How much can you control the movement? Okay, so we're not just flying through things with momentum. We're not just going through the motions. We want to be able to feel and control every inch, every centimeter, every little minuscule component of our movements. If that's a push-up, can you control all the way down, all the way up, right? It's about how much you can really feel the movement. This brings me to the next item on the list when we're talking about quality, is mind-muscle connection. So it can be a little bit confusing to understand, okay, maybe I'm doing push-ups. Which muscle groups do I need to be really focused on? Most people understand that with push-ups, we're building up our chest, our shoulders, our triceps, but there is a lot more to it. And then sometimes with other exercises that might be more complex, or maybe we're just not as familiar with, it can be hard to understand which muscle groups are working in certain movement patterns. We're going to be talking a little bit more about this in a second, but you do want to do your best to connect your mind with your body and specifically focus on the muscle groups that are working during an exercise. Focusing on your chest, your shoulders, your triceps while doing your push-ups is going to help you stimulate the muscles more, to bring blood flow to the area, and just generally get more gains out of every repetition, out of every movement that you do by focusing on the working muscles. That is absolutely critical. And it's also a huge opportunity. With movement training, we're not typically manipulating external objects like weights or resistance bands or something like that. We are manipulating our own body. This is an opportunity to tune in, to check and see if you can feel which muscles are working, and to get deeper into those muscles by thinking about them as you're performing your exercises. That is critical. So that's the first mindset shift, going from focused on quantity to focusing on quality. Absolutely critical. The second mindset shift is focusing on movement patterns instead of muscle groups. So again, typically standard gym workouts, weightlifting, things like that, we're very focused on what muscle groups are we working. You don't necessarily need to just work your chest, just work your shoulders, just work your triceps. If you start to think more broadly about general movement patterns, like for instance, again, I'll continue using this example of a push-up. You could think, I'm gonna do a push-up today because I'm going to do chest today. Or you can think, I'm gonna do push-ups today because it's a pushing day. Working more generally on the movement pattern of pushing, or maybe even of crawling, than necessarily going, okay, I gotta do my chest, I gotta do my shoulders, I gotta do my triceps. Or, oh, it's leg day, so I'm gonna do squats. Maybe instead you're focused on the movement pattern of squatting or lunging. It gets us to perform a lot more compound movement patterns, meaning multiple joints are moving at the same time, as opposed to isolated movement patterns. Honestly, you're gonna get a lot more gains out of doing tons of rows than doing bicep curls. Like, a weightlifter will tell you this too. There is a lot more opportunity for growth in compound movements than there are in isolation movements. You'll see in movement training, there are very few isolation movements. Almost everything is compound. Multiple joints are moving at the same time. And by thinking more about movement patterns than we do about individual muscle groups, we will naturally tend towards those compound movements. And this is a big opportunity for growth, for gains, for strength and mobility increases. What are those essential movement patterns we need to be focused on? We need to create some foundations, some very strong foundations in the movement patterns I'm about to go through, in order to create that base that we can build upon to get into more complex areas of movement and bodyweight training. One of the first movement patterns is pushing, or I also like to think about it as crawling. So again, push-ups are a great example of pushing or crawling. Another example of this would be like a beast walk. I use this regularly in the animal flow system. You could also start to get more complex with this with things like crocodile crawls or even dragon crawls. Those are very cool, very fun exercises to try. Pushing and crawling patterns generally work the whole front of the body. If you're doing something like push-ups, this is going to be more focused on your upper body. But if you're doing something like beast walks, crocodile crawls, dragon crawls, this is going to work everything from your chest, your shoulders, your triceps, to your abs, your quadriceps, literally more or less every muscle on the front of your body. The second essential movement pattern is pulling or hanging. Now, usually this involves something to hang off of or pull off of. I do like to bring one piece of equipment with me when I travel now, and that is a set of gymnastics rings. I can set them up in a tree, I can set them up in my home usually. There's usually somewhere you can find to set up a pair of gymnastics rings, and they're a great piece of equipment to build up strength and mobility in your pulling and hanging patterns. So starting with one of the easiest pulling patterns in movement training, a bodyweight row. You could move on to a chin-up or a pull-up, and then getting even more complex, you could start getting into things like muscle-ups. Pulling and hanging are a really critical one that you don't see in all forms of movement training. For instance, things like yoga and animal flow don't include anything hanging off of a bar or hanging off of anything really, which is a major missing component. Our body evolved to swing from trees and hang from stuff. And so in order to have a fully functioning human body, we do need to get some pulling and hanging practice into our movement training in order to work on mostly your upper back, but really the whole posterior chain or the back of the body. Pulling and hanging practices are going to work things like your lats, your scapular retractors, or your the muscles between your shoulder blades, the rear delts, so the back of the shoulders, your biceps. It's going to work your lower back. It could even work your glutes and your hamstrings, depending on what kind of exercise you're working on. The third essential movement pattern is squatting or lunging. Very similar. Squatting, both legs are doing the same thing. Lunging, one leg's doing something slightly different than the other one. But of course, a very essential movement pattern for your lower body. Squatting can be as simple as a bodyweight squat. It can also get a little bit more difficult with things like pistol squats, or even something as complex and as difficult as a dragon squat. These movement patterns are really going to work your entire lower body, but primarily they're going to be working the glutes, hamstrings, quadriceps, calves, and probably your core as well. In fact, pretty much everything in movement training is going to work your core at least a little bit. The fourth essential movement pattern is hinging and folding. Okay, so hinging can be seen as something similar to, like, for instance, deadlifts are a hinging pattern. This is mostly involving your lower body, but we're focused mostly at moving and hinging at the hips as opposed to bending the knees quite as much. Hinging and folding is basically bringing your belly to your thighs. Now, it's important to understand that you can do these for strength or you can do these for mobility. You can do something like an active good morning as a strength, stability, or control exercise. And this is kind of like a bodyweight variation of a deadlift. Or if you're looking for something more passive to help you with flexibility and mobility, you can work on things like your forward fold or Jefferson curls. These are essential movement patterns to be practicing, and I can guarantee that getting a great forward fold and getting a great hinge pattern is going to help you a lot with bodyweight skills that a lot of people enjoy practicing. Like, for instance, a press to handstand is a huge one. You need a great forward fold to get a good press to handstand. So make sure you're practicing lots of hinging and folding. Another critical movement pattern to be practicing is backbending and extending. This is where oftentimes you'll see people performing things like wheel pose. We're extending the spine, opening the chest, and we're really using the whole back of the body here again. Examples of backbending exercises, starting with fundamental ones, would be a glute bridge, or bridge pose as it's called in yoga. You can start to get a little bit more intense with these with a full wheel pose, or that's what it's called in yoga. In gymnastics, it's called a back bridge. And you can start to get really complex and a lot more intense or difficult with these by performing things like scorpion handstands, or scorpion forearm stands, things like that. Little tip for backbending and extending: make sure you are not overdoing it on your low back. It's very common that when we start backbending practice, our low back starts to feel really sore. Make sure that you are opening up your hip flexors with something like a low lunge. Opening up the hip flexors is going to put a lot more ease on the low back, and it's going to help you get much deeper into these postures as well. So use a low lunge regularly, and make sure that if your low back starts to hurt when you're doing any kind of backbending practice, that you take your foot off the gas, just relax, take a break, and make sure that you're opening up your hip flexors first before putting excessive extension, especially into your lumbar spine. Try to extend through your upper back or your thoracic spine, and try to extend through the hip flexors instead of putting too much pressure on your lumbar spine. That's not going to do you well in the long run. You don't want to have too flexible of a lumbar spine when you're like 80. It's not going to feel too good. The next movement pattern is inverting. This is one of the most fun ones. This is definitely one of my favorites for somebody who wants to learn how to do a handstand or a headstand or a forearm stand. Well, that's what inversions are for. Inversions are anything where your heart is above your head. So this could start with something as simple as a downward facing dog, where we're kind of hanging the head towards the ground. The heart is actually higher than our head. Please be careful with inversions as well, especially if you're somebody who has a little bit of like inertia. If you find that you get a little bit dizzy if you stand up too quick sometimes. Inverting can put some funky stresses on the body because our blood pressure changes in parts of the body that are used to being up top, like our head. We're now putting them underneath, so our blood pressure changes quite a lot, and this can be difficult on certain parts of the body, like for instance our head. Our heart has to work a little bit differently too, so it can be stressful on the cardiovascular system sometimes. But as long as you take it slow, you should be perfectly fine, and your body will adapt to these positions very well. In fact, again, our bodies evolved to be in inverted positions, not constantly, but sometimes. And so it's important that we practice them. They're also a lot of fun. You can also move into things like shoulder stands, headstands, forearm stands, and of course, handstands. These are all examples of inversions. There are many other ones, but those are some of the classics. Inverting is generally going to work on our upper traps, our shoulders, and everything that's like from here up. It's like the neck up. We are going to use our core a little bit to keep our body in, usually in straight alignment, but inversions are primarily a shoulder and neck thing because we're working so hard with this part of our body to support the rest of our body weight. Just 2 movement patterns left. Twisting and rotating. This is where the core really comes into play. There's, again, just like with hinging and folding, there's kind of like 2 ways you should be thinking about twisting and rotating. There's more of an active way and there's more of a passive way. But there's also something that's much, much more focused on stability. As I was saying earlier with your backbending, we don't want to be putting too much pressure, or in this case, torque, on the lumbar spine. Our core is designed to keep the lumbar spine safe. And so we need to learn how to actively move through this range of motion using our strength, but we also need to know how to brace our core and actively resist rotation. For active twisting, we can practice something like windshield wipers. We can do it simply with the knees bent. We can start to extend the legs straight to make this a little bit more complex. For anti-rotation or resisting rotation, we can perform things like under switches. And if you're somebody who I've taught before, or you're a fan of your animal flow, you'll know under switches from the animal flow system. This is a good example where we are actually resisting the rotation in the core, and we're bracing the core as the body turns, but if you pay close attention, the core is actually staying very tight and not moving at all. So that is twisting and rotating. Very obviously, that is going to work quite intensely on your core. Finally, The last movement pattern that is a fundamental is rolling and flipping. This one is really important for safety, as well as it's just interesting and fun. Practicing things as simple as a somersault, getting a little bit more complex with things like cartwheels, or getting really intense with things like macacos from capoeira, or even backflips to get really intense, are very important to keep ourselves safe. Usually when we fall, we have a tendency to fall and put our hands out and we land on our wrists, and that's when we sometimes break our wrists or get injuries. And if we learn to roll and to flip a lot more smoothly, we can actually brace our falls, or we can actually roll out of our falls quite nicely. So I always teach somersaults and cartwheels as a method of falling safely out of a handstand. That's a great example of how rolling and flipping can keep us safe in the rest of our movement practice. But there are really countless applications. And if you watch a really talented mover, you'll see how rolling and flipping gets put right into flows and workouts, but can also keep us very safe if we make a mistake or if we do fall, which is going to happen quite a bit in this practice. There's 8 essential patterns that I've covered today. And in your training practice, you should be covering all 8 patterns. If one of them's missing, you're missing a piece from your practice. Now you can build in splits in your training, just like you would with your more standard workouts. A lot of people do the bro split, where they do chest, and then they do back, and then they do legs, and then they do core, and then they do arms. I'm not a fan of the bro split. That's a whole nother conversation for muscle groups. But you should be splitting up your various movement patterns into different workouts, so that you make sure you're hitting all of them. A lot of them are very related. For instance, squatting and lunging, hinging and folding are both very lower body dominant and make sense to put into one workout. Backbending and extending and pulling and hanging are also very posterior chain dominant patterns, and so it makes sense to put them into one workout. Pushing and crawling and inverting I often put into one workout because they're all very focused on pushing muscles, shoulders, things like that. And you can kind of logically think about your movement patterns that way to loosely group them into different workouts. But I'm gonna save that discussion for a whole another video, talking about how to split up your programming for movement training. For now, just make sure you're getting used to some of the fundamental exercises that I demonstrated and mentioned in this video today, and that you have good foundations in all 8 of those movement patterns before trying to get into complex or difficult exercises. As well, please remember those 2 fundamental mindset shifts that I mentioned. The first one, focusing more on quality and quantity. They are both important. When we're focused on movement training, quality is the big factor, okay? And the second mindset shift is from muscle groups to movement patterns. But we've covered that in detail already, okay? So this is the first video in a long series I'm going to be doing on getting started with bodyweight training. I really hope that this helped you get an understanding of some of the fundamental movement patterns, as well as the mindset shifts that are required to start this practice. If you're looking for programs to follow along to, if you're looking for more information and guidance with movement training, or even things like breathwork and meditation, you can always check out the Evolution Collective. I've got more than 230 classes, tutorials, and flows that you can follow along with. Also, 9 bodyweight training programs. You can book a consultation with myself, and you can book my live classes that happen pretty much every week. I really trust that you enjoyed this video. I hope that it was useful. I hope that I'm starting to teach you how to fish instead of just giving you a fish. As always, wishing you very well.